Just strange. And here it is. It's 2015. Individual air transportation is nowhere to be seen. In fact, in the United States, there's not even so much as a bullet train. But we seem to be the linchpin in global technocracy. So, anyway.
It's true. Yep. And Randolph Hearst, by the way, an eccentric guy that he was, very eccentric. Maybe not insane, but he was totally eccentric. He viewed his newspaper network as having been played by Howard Scott, and I think Howard Scott really did play him big time. Really? He learned how to pump the free press, to get articles written and stuff. And after Scott was discovered to be a fraud, not even having a degree, and after Columbia University booted him, Randolph Hearst got the idea there's major egg on his face if he didn't disassociate with Howard Scott and technocracy.
Pretty good thinking.
That's why he wrote that memo. But the unintended consequence of that also was why it got scrubbed from the history books. You see, history is dissected looking backwards.
Yeah. And
the way historians look at things, they go back 25 years and they see, well, what was being written about in those days, and then they go, oh, that must have been important because here's 15 articles in the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle or whatever, and they figure, well, okay, we're going to put that in the history book. We'll analyze it, put it in the history book. Well, when Randolph Hearst said no more articles on technocracy, guess what happened? There was just a vacuum, an overnight vacuum on technocracy. So when historians went back to see what was important in the day, technocracy didn't come up on the radar.
Mm-hmm.
There's no press.
Still existed, just not available for public viewing.
Yeah, they just ignored it, and they didn't put it out of the history books. I found a lot of information. I found a number of books that I was able to easily get that were written in the 30s and 40s. I found a huge archive of technocracy material up at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, of all places. And I went up there and spent a week at this library. They brought out cart after cart after cart of original documents and magazines and papers and letters, pictures. It was just a goldmine. And what had happened is all the leaders of technocracy up there in Canada, before they died in the 1990s, they all got together kind of for one last meeting, if you will, and they said, we need to pool our information and get a university to accept it, to keep it for posterity. And so they got University of Alberta to take it. And I don't think there's probably been 10 people that ever looked at it from what they told me up there that ever cared. I was you're here for what? Well, I know you got it back there because I saw it on your catalog, And so they said, okay, well, we'll bring it out. And they gave me access to a copy machine. And here they just start pulling these boxes out, these library boxes. Man, I'm going through them left and right and making copies and, taking notes and everything. I found everything I ever could have. I probably could have written 5 books as a result, just what I found there.
Unbelievable.
But it was there. It was discoverable. It's just nobody ever bothered to do it. And yet, the Hollywood Bowl was full of people learning about technocracy.
Extraordinary.
In the 1930s.
If you'd like to, pick it up. We were talking about the executive component.
Right.
A little bit earlier. If you want to just pick it up and go forward, I'm just going to sit back and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of hijacking the executive branch of our government was huge. They needed to get a hold of the mechanism to change trade policy throughout the world. And they did that through the World Bank presidents. They did it through the USTR. That's the U.S. Trade Representative position. These are the people these are the engine drivers of the globalization process. It has been a trilateral globalization process, and I just have to say, don't let anybody try and convince you to the contrary, that there's some other policy group that's in charge of the globalization process in the last 40 years, because it simply isn't true. They're not looking high enough on the hierarchy, if you will, to see who's really at the top of it. We're seeing here who's at the top of it is these members of the Trilateral Commission. So when we look at the executive branch itself, since 1977, when Jimmy Carter got elected, both Carter and Mondale were members of the commission. Later, Brzezinski wrote that he had handpicked, and he bragged about it, he had handpicked Carter for presidency in the first place. in 1973. He groomed him and trained him in all areas of foreign policy before he became president. So he was Brzezinski's guy. Brzezinski bragged about it. Nobody disputes that today if you do some research on it. But both Carter and Mondale were both members. Then along comes Ronald Reagan. George H.W. Bush comes in as vice president. That was never meant to be by the people. George Bush got bounced out of the primary in 79, completely bounced out, or in 80. And he got bounced out in Florida, by the way, because of a guy who stood up in the audience waving a copy of my book, Trilaterals over Washington. And it was the last straw for Bush because he had been dogged during the campaign with people standing up waving my book. It's easy to spot. It's a red and white copy.
Unbelievable. That's excellent.
And they were asking him questions. Hey, are you a member of the Trilateral Commission? Are you, do you agree with this? And then they'd say something that the Trilateral Commission said. And they were people were livid. They understood it. And Bush finally melted in Florida, Dade County, melted down, turned red. You know when people melt down, you can tell. He turned red, starts yelling, cursing. A string of four-letter words came out of his mouth that would just make a drunken sailor embarrassed. And he ended up by basically walking off the stage.
And this was HW or W?
HW.
No kidding. He flipped out and started cussing at people?
You can't win the nomination without Florida. Everybody,
I think everybody knows that one, yeah.
And so he lost Florida as a result and lost the primary to Ronald Reagan. And nobody figured he'd make a comeback at this point. But guess who, none other than Henry Kissinger, was operating within the GOP hierarchy. And Henry Kissinger came in. He's a member of the Trilateral Commission, by the way. And he came in, he says, George H.W. Bush is going to be your vice president if you want to survive. That's basically the proposition.
If you want to survive?
Well, it wasn't a threat to kill him, but, if you want to survive politically, then you're going to take George H.W. Bush. And they had always intended that Bush would win the presidency in the first place. Reagan was not supposed to happen. But he did. And they couldn't just kick him out. So they said, look, you're taking Bush or else. And so he took Bush. The headline, by the way, after Bush melted down in Dade County, the headline the next day was, have you ever seen a burning bush?
Oh, man. Did this get much play? I don't remember this.
It didn't. That was the end of it. And then, the convention took place right after that. It was right before the convention. Bush thought he had it completely nailed at that point. He thought he was in. He really did. And his horrible performance at that last speech was this. I think that was his last speech that he gave. And the primary took place. Reagan took Florida as well. And then Bush got put back in as the candidate for VP after that. And then, of course, he became president. Well, bottom line is George H.W. Bush was a member of the Trilateral Commission. That's all there is. When Bush was president, Dan Quayle was his vice president. Quayle had nothing to do with the Trilateral Commission. When Bill Clinton came in 93, Bill Clinton and Al Gore both were members. Again, it was just like Carter and Mondale again. Both of them were members of the Trilateral Commission. We didn't have a choice in that election, to tell you. And then comes George W. Bush in 2001. Dick Cheney was his vice presidential candidate and vice president for 8 years. And Dick Cheney was a member of the Trilateral Commission. Dick Cheney's wife, by the way, Lynn Cheney, was also a member of the Trilateral Commission in her own right. Think about that for a minute. I said, hey, honey, how are things down at the Trilateral Commission today? Well, I had a good day. I decided policy in Bosnia this week. I don't know what they talked about at night, but it's an interesting combination. They're the only husband-wife team that ever belonged to the Trilateral Commission independently.
It's a small world after all.
After all, we could sing that, but not with my voice. So then comes Barack Obama. and Joe Biden, probably the two biggest buffoons the presidency has ever seen. And Obama is very much like Jimmy Carter. He's basically an empty suit type of a person who can be molded and who can be instructed to deliver some party line that's not his.
I suspect it can be blackmailed pretty easily, too.
Probably. And then there's, Biden's along the same line. We'll see in a minute, however, how the Trilaterals have surrounded the presidents through their national security advisors. And this is a stunning display as well. It's like, oh my gosh, how could every time I look at this, I just get, I get hacked off again. But since 1973, there have been a total of 17 members or 17 NSAs. Now, the NSA, the reason I mention this is a very important position. He's the gatekeeper for the president. Nobody can walk in to talk about anything to do with national security and get to the president without going through the NSA. That's the only way to get there. The NSA is the person that briefs the president on a daily basis. He's a personal briefer, if you will, to the president for intelligence and security matters on what's going on in the world. So the NSA is a hugely important position. Since 1973, 10 out of 17 of the NSAs have been members of the Trilateral Commission. 10 out of 17. You had Henry Kissinger, Brett Scowcroft, Brzezinski, Frank Carlucci in 1986, Anthony Lake in 1993, Condoleezza Rice with George Bush, Carter in the Obama administration. You've had General James Jones, Tom Donilon, and the current NSA is Susan Rice, and she is also a member of the Trilateral Commission. So they're surrounded, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
They're surrounded. And I did a study, by the way. I'll just do a little side note here. I did a study just recently to add up, kind of analyze the U.S. membership of the commission. I did this when the new Department of Defense cabinet position was filled by Ashton Carter. This just recently. This is back in December 10. Ashton Carter just so happens is a member of the Trilateral Commission. And he's currently the Secretary of Defense.
Yes.
Okay.
Excellent.
So I did a little study, and I went through and I added up the Susan Rices and Sylvia Burwell, the Director of the Office of Management Budget, Michael Froman, the USTR, Tom Donilon, Dennis Blair, Austin Goolsbee. He was a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and the list goes on. But I wanted to see percentage-wise what was going on. So I kind of broke it down, and what I came up with is that of the people that are available to serve in positions, elected positions or appointed positions like this in government, and of course, the head of GE, for instance, is not going to take a cabinet level position. Some people just don't do that kind of thing. But of the people available to serve the government in a high level capacity like this, and also of those members who are of the Democrat persuasion versus the Republican persuasion, because they flip-flop back and forth. Bush had his crew of trilaterals who were Republicans. Clinton had his crew of trilaterals who were Democrats. That makes sense from a political point of view. Otherwise, everybody'd be on their game. But of the people that are available to be appointed to positions in the government, Obama has cycled through 92% of that list in 8 years, or 6 years now.
Wow.
Can you picture that? It's like his sole source of influence is coming from the Trilateral Commission. They've got virtually every possible member that is in a position to serve, serving somewhere in the Obama administration, and many of them right close at hand.